The gunshot that killed Clara's father echoed in her mind as she pressed herself against the cold earth wall of the root cellar, her breath coming in short gasps that sent small clouds into the frigid Montana air. She had been running for 3 days straight since fleeing the town of Republic, Montana, where her father had been gunned down in the street by Wade Larkin, a cattle baron who had decided their small homestead sat on land he wanted. It was December 1881, and the snow had started falling in earnest, covering her tracks but also threatening to freeze her to death if she did not find better shelter soon. This root cellar, buried into the hillside of what appeared to be a well-maintained ranch, seemed like providence, even if discovery might mean her death. Clara Lawson was 22 years old and had never imagined she would be hiding like a rabbit from hunters, trembling in the dark with only the smell of stored potatoes and carrots for company. Her father had taught her to be strong, to stand tall, but strength meant nothing when bullets flew and corrupt lawmen looked the other way because the shooter had money and influence. She had witnessed it all from the general store window, had seen her father crumple to the ground, had heard Larkin tell the sheriff that her pa had drawn first, which was a lie so bold it had made her gasp. Then Larkin had pointed at the store, had said something to his men, and Clara had known with absolute certainty that they would come for her next, that dead men told no tales and neither did their daughters. So she had run. Now, 3 days later, she was at the end of her strength. The old blanket she had grabbed from their homestead was threadbare. Her supplies had run out that morning, and her fingers were so cold she could barely feel them. The root cellar was dark except for the thin lines of light that crept through the gaps in the wooden door above. She could hear footsteps occasionally, the heavy tread of boots on frozen ground, and once she had heard a man's voice, deep and steady, talking to what sounded like a horse. The owner of this ranch, whoever he was. Clara closed her eyes and prayed he would not need to visit his root cellar today. Or tomorrow. She needed time to think, to plan, to figure out what to do next. Republic was 20 miles back the way she had come, but Larkin's reach extended far beyond the town limits. He had men everywhere, or so people whispered. Her only living relative was an aunt in San Francisco, but California might as well have been the moon for all the chance she had of reaching it with no money, no horse, and winter closing in like a fist. The door above her head suddenly swung open, flooding the cellar with gray winter light. Clara's heart stopped, then hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She pressed herself further into the corner behind a stack of wooden crates, making herself as small as possible, but it was futile. The man who climbed down the ladder had the build of someone who spent his days working land and cattle, and his eyes adjusted to the dimness within seconds. "Well," he said, his voice calm despite the obvious shock of finding a woman in his root cellar. "This is unexpected." Clara could not speak. Her throat had closed up with fear and exhaustion. She could only stare at him, taking in the details that might matter if she needed to run again. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes that were an unusual shade of green. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. He wore a heavy wool coat over work clothes, and his boots were covered in mud and snow. Most importantly, he did not have a gun drawn, though she could see one holstered at his hip. "Are you hurt?" he asked when she did not respond. His voice was gentler now, as though he was speaking to a spooked animal. Clara shook her head, not trusting her voice yet. "Are you running from someone?" This time she nodded. The man was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those green eyes. Then he did something that surprised her completely. He backed up to the ladder and started climbing out. "Stay there," he said. "I will bring you something warm to drink and some food. Then we can talk." He closed the door behind him, and Clara was left in darkness again, her mind reeling. She had expected anger, demands, threats to turn her over to the law. Instead, this stranger had offered her food and warmth. It made no sense, unless it was a trap. Maybe he had gone to get help, to fetch other men who would drag her back to Republic and Larkin. But what choice did she have? She was too weak to run, too cold to think straight. If this was the end, at least it would be quick. The door opened again 15 minutes later. The man descended with more difficulty this time because he was carrying a basket in one hand. He set it down on the earthen floor and gestured to it. "There is hot coffee in the jar, wrapped in towels to keep it warm, bread and butter, some dried beef. Eat slowly, you look half-starved." Clara stared at the basket as though it might contain snakes. "My name is Matthew Turner," the man said. "This is my ranch, the Double T, about 5 miles east of Republic. I run cattle and horses, and I live alone except for my 2 ranch hands who have gone to Missoula for supplies and will not be back for a week. Nobody knows you are here except me, and I am not in the habit of turning away people in need without hearing their story first." Something in his voice made Clara believe him. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was desperation, but she reached for the basket with shaking hands. The coffee jar was indeed warm, almost hot, and when she managed to unscrew the lid, the smell of fresh coffee hit her like a physical thing. She took a sip and nearly wept at the heat of it spreading through her body. Matthew Turner watched her drink, then eat, with the patience of a man used to dealing with frightened creatures. When she had taken the edge off her hunger, he spoke again. "What is your name?" "Clara," she said, her voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. "Clara Lawson." Recognition flashed across his face. Lawson. That was the name of the man who was killed in Republic 3 days ago. The sheriff said it was a fair fight. "It was murder," Clara said, and suddenly the words were pouring out of her, the whole terrible story. She told him about their homestead, about how Larkin had wanted their land, about the increasingly threatening visits, the offers that were not really offers. She told him about watching her father die, about Larkin's lies, about running because she knew she would be next. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face, cutting tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. Matthew's jaw was tight, his eyes hard. "Wade Larkin is a snake," he said flatly. "Always has been. He has been trying to buy out half the ranchers in this valley, and those who will not sell tend to have unfortunate accidents. The law will not touch him because he has the territorial governor in his pocket, or so people say." "Then you understand why I ran," Clara said. "I do," Matthew agreed. "But you cannot stay in my root cellar. Winter here will kill you as surely as Larkin's bullet would." Clara's brief hope crumbled. Of course he would not help her. Why would he risk Larkin's wrath for a stranger? "I understand," she said quietly. "I will leave tonight." "That is not what I meant," Matthew said, and now there was something that might have been amusement in his voice. "I meant you should come up to the house. You can stay there at least until we figure out what to do next. I can hardly leave you to freeze to death in my root cellar." "What kind of man would that make me?" Clara looked at him, trying to understand his angle, what he wanted from her. In her experience, men did not help women out of pure goodness, not without expecting something in return. But his eyes were steady and honest, and she was too tired and too cold to refuse, even if it was a mistake. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Matthew was quiet for a moment, then said, "Because it is the right thing to do, and because I know what it is like to lose everything to men like Larkin." He stood up, offering her his hand. "Come on up to the house. You can have a proper meal and a bath, and we will work out the details after you have rested." Clara took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. Her legs nearly buckled after sitting in the cold for so many hours, but Matthew steadied her with a hand on her elbow. Together, they climbed out of the root cellar into the gray December afternoon. The ranch house was a solid 2-story structure built of logs and stone, with smoke rising from 2 chimneys. It looked warm and safe, and Clara felt something loosen in her chest at the sight of it. Matthew led her up the porch steps and through the front door into a room that was blessedly warm. A fire crackled in a large stone fireplace, and the furniture, while simple, looked sturdy and comfortable. "The kitchen is through there," Matthew said, pointing to a doorway. "Let me get the fire built up in the stove, and I will heat water for a bath. There is a room upstairs you can use." It was my sister's before she married and moved to Helena. Clara stood in the middle of the room, dripping melted snow onto the wooden floor, and tried to process the fact that this was happening, that a stranger was being kind to her with no apparent strings attached. It felt surreal, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. Matthew moved through the house with efficient purpose, building up the fire in the kitchen stove, hauling in water from the pump outside to heat in large pots. While the water warmed, he showed her to the room upstairs. It was small but clean, with a bed covered in quilts, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the snowy fields. "I will bring up the tub and water when it is ready," Matthew said. "There should be some of my sister's old clothes in the dresser. You are about the same size, I think. Help yourself to whatever you need." He left her alone, and Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her mind spinning. She should be more cautious, more suspicious, but exhaustion was winning out over good sense. When Matthew returned with the tin bathtub and buckets of hot water, she barely managed to thank him before he left her to her privacy. The bath was heaven. Clara scrubbed 3 days of dirt and fear from her skin, washed her long brown hair, and let herself cry properly for the first time since her father's death. The tears came in great wrenching sobs that left her feeling hollow, but somehow lighter. When the water grew cold, she dried off with the towel Matthew had left and found a simple cotton dress and wool stockings in the dresser, just as he had said. They fit well enough. When she made her way back downstairs, her hair still damp and hanging in waves down her back, she found Matthew in the kitchen, cooking. The smell of frying bacon and onions made her stomach growl despite the food she had eaten in the cellar. "Feel better?" he asked without turning from the stove. "Yes," Clara said. "Thank you for everything." "Sit down," Matthew said, nodding toward the kitchen table. "Supper will be ready in a few minutes." Clara sat and watched him cook with the ease of someone who had been doing it for a long time. "You said your sister used to live here?" she asked, wanting to fill the silence with something other than her own anxious thoughts. "Sarah," Matthew confirmed. "She married a lawyer from Helena 2 years ago. I see her maybe twice a year now. My parents died when I was 25, left me this ranch. Sarah was only 19 at the time. I raised her for a few years until she was old enough to make her own choices." "How old are you now?" Clara asked. 29, Matthew said. He plated the food and brought it to the table, sitting across from her. "Been running this place for 4 years on my own, not counting the hands. It is good work, honest work. I have no quarrel with anyone and I keep to myself mostly." They ate in companionable silence for a while. Clara was acutely aware that this was the strangest dinner of her life, sharing a meal with a man she had met only hours ago, a man who had found her hiding in his root cellar like a thief. Yet there was something solid and trustworthy about Matthew Turner, something that made her feel safer than she had felt in days. "What will you do?" Matthew asked eventually. "You cannot go back to Republic, that much is clear. Do you have family elsewhere?" "An aunt in San Francisco," Clara said. but I have no money for passage, and I would not make it a mile on foot in this weather." Matthew nodded slowly. "Then you should stay here until spring. By then, maybe things will have settled down. Larkin might have moved on to other prey, or I can stake you the money for a train ticket west." Clara stared at him. "You would let me stay here? For months?" "The house is big enough," Matthew said with a shrug, "and I could use the help if you are willing. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I am not much good at domestic things, and the hands are even worse. If you stayed and worked, you would earn your keep and save money for your journey." It was a practical solution, almost too practical. Clara searched his face for any hint of ulterior motive and found none. "I do not understand why you are being so kind to me," she said softly. Matthew met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw something other than calm competence there, something sad and old. "5 years ago, my parents were killed when their wagon overturned on the way back from town. Everyone said it was an accident, that my father had been driving too fast. But I found evidence that the wagon had been tampered with, that the axle had been deliberately weakened. I could never prove it, but I knew it was Larkin's doing. My father had refused to sell him a section of our land that bordered a creek. After my parents died, Larkin came to me with an offer. I turned him down. He has left me alone since then, maybe because I have friends in the territorial legislature, maybe because I am better armed than your father was. But I know what that man is capable of, and I will not let him add another victim to his tally if I can help it." Clara felt tears prick her eyes again. "I am sorry about your parents." "And I am sorry about your father," Matthew said gently. "But we are both still here, still alive. That means something." Clara nodded. "I will stay then, until spring, and I will work to earn my keep, I promise." "I know you will," Matthew said, and he smiled for the first time since finding her in his root cellar. It transformed his face, made him look younger and less careworn. Clara felt something flutter in her chest that she firmly ignored. She had no business developing feelings for the man who had saved her life. That way lay complication and heartache. But as the days turned into weeks and December gave way to January, Clara found it increasingly difficult to ignore the way her heart lifted when Matthew came in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots and bringing the smell of winter and horses with him. She found herself looking forward to their meals together, to the easy conversation that had developed between them. Matthew was well-read and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise and made her laugh when she had thought she might never laugh again. For his part, Matthew found himself watching Clara more than he should, noticing the way she moved through his kitchen with increasing confidence, the way she hummed while she worked, the way her eyes lit up when she smiled. She had been so frightened and fragile that first day, but with food and rest and safety, she had begun to bloom like a flower that had been starved of sunlight. She was beautiful, he could not deny that, but it was more than her looks. She was intelligent and resourceful, quick to learn and quicker to laugh once she let her guard down. She had a strength in her that had been tested by tragedy but not broken. By February, the household had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Clara woke early to make breakfast before Matthew headed out to tend the cattle and horses. She spent her days cleaning, mending, baking, preparing meals, and generally making the house feel lived in and cared for in a way it had not been since Sarah left. In the evenings, she and Matthew would sit by the fire, and he would read aloud from books or newspapers, or they would simply talk about everything and nothing. The ranch hands, Tom and Eddie, returned from Missoula in mid-February, and Matthew told them that Clara was a cousin who had fallen on hard times and was staying to help with the house. The men accepted this without question, tipping their hats respectfully to Clara and praising her cooking effusively. They were good men, loyal to Matthew, and Clara felt safe with them around. But it was Matthew who occupied her thoughts more and more. She had never felt this way about anyone before. This constant awareness of another person, this desire to be near them, to hear their voice, to see them smile. She tried to tell herself it was just gratitude, that she was confusing appreciation for rescue with something deeper, but she knew she was lying to herself. One evening in late February, a blizzard rolled in with terrifying speed. Matthew had been out checking on the cattle in the far pasture and barely made it back to the barn before the full force of the storm hit. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching the snow come down in thick white curtains, her heart in her throat. She could not see the barn from the house, could not see anything but white. An hour passed, then two. Clara paced the kitchen, jumping at every sound, imagining Matthew frozen in a drift somewhere between the barn and the house. She was on the verge of doing something foolish like going out to look for him when the kitchen door burst open and Matthew stumbled in, covered head to toe in snow, his face red with cold. "Thank God," Clara said, rushing to him. "I was so worried." Matthew was shivering so hard he could barely speak. Clara helped him out of his frozen coat and boots, led him to the chair by the stove, and wrapped him in blankets. She heated water for coffee and brought him a mug, her hands shaking slightly. "I am fine," Matthew said through chattering teeth. "Just cold. The cattle are secured in the lower pasture where there is some shelter. Tom and Eddie are in the bunkhouse. Everyone is safe." Clara knelt beside his chair, her hand on his arm. "You scared me," she said softly. Matthew looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his eyes. "Clara," he said, and her name on his lips sounded different than it ever had before, weighted with meaning. "Yes," she whispered. "I need to tell you something," Matthew said. "I have been trying not to, trying to be respectful of your situation, of the fact that you are here because you have nowhere else to go. But I cannot keep it to myself any longer." Clara's heart was pounding. "What is it?" "I have feelings for you," Matthew said, the words coming out in a rush. "More than just friendship. I think I have been falling in love with you since the day I found you in my root cellar, frightened but defiant. You have brought light into this house, into my life, and I do not want you to leave in the spring. I want you to stay, not as someone who works for her keep, but as someone who belongs here, with me." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "Matthew," she said, "I have been fighting the same feelings. I told myself it was just gratitude, that I was being foolish, that you could not possibly feel the same way. But I love you. I think I have loved you for weeks now." Matthew's face broke into a smile that was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He reached for her hand, pulled her closer. "I am going to kiss you now," he said, "if that is all right with you." "It is more than all right," Clara whispered, and then his lips were on hers, warm and gentle and perfect. The kiss was everything she had imagined and more, a promise and a beginning. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me," he said. "Not just until spring, forever." "Yes," Clara said without hesitation. "Yes, I will stay." The blizzard raged outside for 3 days, but inside the house, there was warmth and joy and the beginning of something beautiful. They talked for hours about the future, about what it would mean for Clara to stay, about the practicalities and the risks. Larkin was still a threat, still a shadow over Clara's life, but Matthew was convinced that if they kept her presence quiet, if she stayed on the ranch and did not venture into Republic, they could manage. "In time," Matthew said, "Larkin will forget about you. He has other schemes, other land to acquire. And if he does not, well, I am prepared to defend what is mine." The possessive way he said it, the determination in his voice, made Clara feel cherished and protected in a way she had never experienced before. She knew she loved him, knew it with a certainty that went bone deep. As winter began to give way to early spring, as the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared in the fields, Clara and Matthew's relationship deepened. They were careful not to scandalize the ranch hands, maintaining separate bedrooms and propriety during the day, but in the evenings they sat close by the fire, holding hands, stealing kisses, making plans. In late March, Matthew rode into Republic to sell some horses and pick up supplies. Clara waited anxiously at the ranch, worried that someone might recognize the name Lawson and make the connection, but Matthew returned safely, bringing with him fabric for a new dress and a letter from his sister Sarah. "I wrote to her," Matthew explained as Clara opened the letter. "Told her about you, about us. I hope you do not mind." Clara read the letter quickly. Sarah's words were warm and welcoming, expressing delight that her brother had found someone to love and inviting them both to visit Helena when the weather was better. "She sounds wonderful," Clara said. "She is," Matthew agreed. "And she is discreet. She will not spread word about you." April brought warmer weather and the beginning of calving season. Clara helped where she could, learning about ranch life with the same determination she had brought to everything else. She was not afraid of hard work or getting her hands dirty, and Matthew found himself falling even deeper in love with her as he watched her gentle a nervous mare or help birth a difficult calf. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Matthew took Clara's hand. "I think it is time," he said. "Time for what?" Clara asked. "To make this official," Matthew said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a gold ring with a small diamond, simple and beautiful. "This was my mother's. I would be honored if you would wear it. Clara Lawson, will you marry me?" Clara felt her eyes fill with tears for what felt like the 100th time since meeting this man. "Yes," she said. 1,000 times yes." Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. They kissed as the sun set behind the mountains, and Clara thought about how far she had come from that terrified woman hiding in a root cellar. She had been running from death and had found life instead. Had found love. They decided to marry quickly and quietly. There was no point in waiting, and neither of them wanted a big fuss. Matthew arranged for a minister from a small church in a town 20 miles to the south, far enough from Republic that there was no risk of Larkin's people hearing about it. Sarah and her husband made the journey from Helena to stand as witnesses, and on a beautiful May morning, Clara and Matthew were married in the living room of the ranch house, with spring flowers on the mantel and joy in their hearts. Sarah embraced Clara warmly after the ceremony. "Welcome to the family," she said. "I am so glad Matthew found you. He has been alone too long." "I am the lucky one," Clara said. "He saved my life." "You saved each other," Sarah said wisely. "That is how the best marriages work." After Sarah and her husband left, Clara and Matthew settled into married life with the same ease they had found in everything else. The awkwardness that Clara had half expected never materialized. Being with Matthew felt natural and right, like coming home after a long journey. Summer came in full force, bringing long days of hard work and short nights of blessed rest. The ranch thrived under their combined efforts. Matthew had never seen the books so organized, the house so clean, the meals so good. Clara had never felt so useful, so needed, so loved. They worked side by side through the long Montana summer, and in the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk about their dreams for the future. In August, Clara began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Matthew. And when she finally did, on a warm evening as they sat by the creek that ran through the property, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He whooped with joy, picked her up and spun her around, then set her down carefully as though she were made of glass. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." "You are happy?" Clara asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Matthew said. "I am elated, overjoyed, terrified," Clara laughed. "Terrified. I have never been a father before," Matthew said. "What if I am terrible at it?" "You will not be," Clara said confidently. "You will be wonderful, just like you are wonderful at everything else." As autumn painted the leaves gold and red, Clara's pregnancy became more obvious. She continued to work as much as she could, though Matthew fretted and tried to make her rest more. The ranch hands treated her with even more respect, if that were possible, and Tom's wife came by from their homestead to help with the heavier chores and to offer advice about childbirth and babies. By October, Clara was fully blooming, her figure rounded with pregnancy, her face glowing with health and happiness. She spent her days in the kitchen, preserving vegetables and fruits for the winter, baking bread, making jams and pickles, preparing the house for the coming cold and the coming baby. The kitchen had become her domain, her sanctuary, the heart of their home. She loved it here, loved the warmth from the big stove, loved the window that looked out over the mountains, loved knowing that Matthew would come through that door every evening and kiss her and ask about her day. One evening in mid-October, as Clara was making dinner, she heard horses approaching the house at speed. It was an unusual sound, and it made her nervous. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window, her heart sinking when she saw 3 men she did not recognize dismounting in the yard. Matthew was still out with the cattle and would not be back for another hour at least. One of the men knocked on the door, hard and demanding. Clara considered not answering, but they had surely seen the smoke from the chimney and the lamp in the window. She opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain on. "Yes, we are looking for Matthew Turner," the man said. He was tall and rough-looking, with mean eyes and a gun on his hip. "He is not here," Clara said. "What is your business with him?" "We have a message from Wade Larkin," the man said, and Clara's blood ran cold. "He wants to make another offer on the creek section of this property. A very generous offer." "My husband is not interested in selling," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man's eyes narrowed. "Your husband should think carefully before refusing. Accidents happen out here. Would be a shame if something happened to you or that baby you are carrying." Clara slammed the door and locked it, her hands shaking. She heard the men laugh outside, heard them mount up and ride away. She stood in the hallway, her heart pounding, her mind racing. After all these months of peace, Larkin had found her. Or had found Matthew and was using the same tactics he always used, threats and intimidation. When Matthew came home an hour later, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table, still trembling. He took one look at her face and crossed the room in 3 strides. "What happened?" She told him about the men, about Larkin's message, about the thinly veiled threat. Matthew's face went dark with anger, but his voice was calm when he spoke. "We will not be intimidated," he said. "I will not sell, and I will not let him hurt you." "Maybe we should sell," Clara said, though the words hurt to say. "If it keeps you safe, if it keeps our baby safe." "No," Matthew said firmly. "That is not how we handle men like Larkin. If we give in once, he will never stop. We stand our ground." Over the next few weeks, Matthew took precautions. He made sure the rifles were always loaded and accessible. He hired an additional ranch hand, a former Army scout named Jack who was good in a fight and loyal. He warned Tom and Eddie to be on the lookout for trouble. and he sent word to his friends in the territorial legislature about Larkin's threats. But November came and went without incident, as did December. Christmas was a quiet, joyful affair, with Clara now very pregnant and Matthew barely letting her lift a finger. They decorated the house with pine boughs and candles, and Matthew gave her a music box that played a gentle lullaby. "For the baby," he said softly, winding it up so the delicate tune filled the room. Clara cried, hormones and happiness making her emotional. In mid-January of 1883, on a night when the snow was falling softly outside and the house was warm and quiet, Clara went into labor. Matthew sent Tom riding hard for the doctor in the nearby town of Cascade, while Eddie's wife, Martha, who had experience as a midwife, came to help. Matthew paced the downstairs like a caged animal, jumping at every sound from the bedroom above. It was a long night, but as dawn broke, the thin cry of a baby filled the house. Martha appeared at the top of the stairs, smiling. "You have a son, Matthew, a strong, healthy boy, and Clara is doing well." Matthew took the stairs 2 at a time and entered the bedroom to find Clara propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "Meet your son," she said softly. Matthew sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the small red face, the tiny fists waving in the air. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect. I love you so much." "I love you too," Clara said. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names endlessly and still not decided. But looking at his son now, Matthew said, "What about John, after my father?" "John Turner," Clara said, trying it out. "I like it. John Matthew Turner." "John Matthew Turner," Matthew repeated, reaching out a finger for his son to grasp. The tiny fingers wrapped around his, and Matthew felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. The weeks after John's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and new routines, but Clara and Matthew navigated it together, learning as they went. Clara spent most of her time in the rocking chair in the kitchen, nursing John and watching the winter landscape out the window, feeling content in a way she had never imagined possible. She thought sometimes about her father, wishing he could have met his grandson, but the grief had softened with time into something she could carry without it breaking her. Spring came again, bringing new life to the ranch. The calves were born, the horses foaled, and John grew from a tiny newborn into a plump, happy baby who smiled at his parents and made cooing sounds that delighted them both. Clara had fully bloomed in the kitchen, in the house, in her life as Matthew's wife and John's mother. She was not the frightened, desperate woman who had hidden in the root cellar anymore. She was strong, confident, loved. In April, word came that Wade Larkin had been arrested for fraud and murder in connection with a land deal gone wrong. Apparently, one of his victims had more political connections than Larkin had anticipated, and the case against him was solid. He would hang, people said, or at least spend the rest of his life in prison. When Matthew brought Clara this news, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had not fully realized she was carrying. "It is over," she said wonderingly. "He cannot hurt anyone anymore." "It is over," Matthew agreed, pulling her into his arms. "We are safe. We are free." That summer, they traveled to Helena to visit Sarah, bringing John to meet his aunt and uncle. Sarah doted on her nephew shamelessly and told Clara that she had never seen Matthew so happy. "You gave him back his life," Sarah said one afternoon as they sat in her garden, watching Matthew play with John on a blanket spread under a tree. "After our parents died, he was so lost, so angry. He threw himself into the ranch, into work, but he was not living. Not really. Then he found you, and suddenly he had purpose again. He had love. He gave me back my life too," Clara said softly. "I was running and scared, and he gave me a home, a family, everything. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered. John grew into a bright, curious child, and when he was 3 years old, he became a big brother to twin daughters, Emma and Rose. The house was full of noise and laughter and chaos, and Clara loved every minute of it, even the difficult ones. Matthew proved to be the wonderful father Clara had known he would be, patient and loving and firm when necessary. He taught John to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, and he rocked the twins to sleep with a gentleness that made Clara's heart ache with love. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Matthew took Clara out to the spot by the creek where he had proposed, leaving the children with Tom and Martha for the evening. They sat on a blanket as the sun set, much as they had on the night Clara told him she was pregnant with John. "You ever regret it?" Matthew asked. "Staying here instead of going to San Francisco, you could have had a different life." "I could have," Clara agreed, "but I would not have had you. I would not have had our children, our home, our life together. I have no regrets, Matthew, not a single one. Do you?" "Only that I did not find you sooner," Matthew said, kissing her softly. "You are everything I never knew I needed." As the years continued to pass, the Turner family became a fixture in the Montana Territory. Matthew served on the town council, helping to build schools and churches. Clara taught at the local school when the children were old enough, sharing her love of reading and learning with the community. John grew into a fine young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. The twins were spirited and smart, keeping their parents on their toes. When Montana achieved statehood in 1889, the Turners celebrated with the rest of the territory, proud to be part of this new chapter in history. By then, Clara was pregnant again, and that winter, she gave birth to another son whom they named James. Matthew joked that they would need to build an addition to the house at this rate, but his eyes were warm with joy. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters, dry summers, lost cattle, financial worries, illnesses, and injuries. But through it all, Clara and Matthew faced everything together. Their love the foundation on which their family was built. On a summer evening in 1895, when Clara was 41 and Matthew was 46, they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard. John was 22 now, already taking on more responsibility with the ranch. The twins were 12, all long legs and laughter. James was 6, following his older brother around with worshipful eyes. "Can you believe it has been 14 years since I found you in my root cellar?" Matthew asked, reaching for Clara's hand. Clara smiled, lacing her fingers through his. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. I was so scared that day." "And now?" Matthew asked. "Now I am home," Clara said simply. "You are my home. This place, these children, this life we have built together. It is more than I ever dreamed possible when I was running through the snow, thinking my life was over." "Your life was just beginning," Matthew said. "We both were." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air smelled of grass and horses, and the jasmine Clara had planted by the porch. From inside the house came the smell of the bread she had baked that afternoon, ready for tomorrow's breakfast. "I love you," Clara said, the words as true and necessary now as they had been the first time she said them. "I love you too," Matthew said. "Forever." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here, from terrified fugitive to beloved wife and mother. She thought about that first winter, hiding in the root cellar, and how by spring she had been blooming in Matthew's kitchen, in his home, in his heart. She thought about all the springs that had followed, each one bringing new growth, new life, new reasons to be grateful. The children's laughter rang out across the yard as John chased the younger ones, and Clara leaned her head on Matthew's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his hand in hers. This was her life now. This was her family, and she had never been happier. As the years continued to unfold, the Turner Ranch became a legacy, passed from one generation to the next. John eventually married a sweet girl from Cascade and gave Matthew and Clara their first grandchildren. The twins both found love, Emma to a teacher from Helena and Rose to a rancher from the next valley over. James decided to become a doctor, studying in the East before returning to Montana to practice. Through it all, Clara and Matthew remained at the center, the heart of the family. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their faces lined with the marks of a life well lived. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren, a gathering so large it filled the expanded ranch house and spilled out into the yard. On the morning of Clara's 70th birthday, she woke to find Matthew already awake, watching her with the same soft expression he had worn on their wedding day. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, just as he did every morning. "Good morning," Clara said, smiling. Her body was old now, stiff and slow, but her heart was as full as it had ever been. They rose and dressed slowly, helping each other with the small tasks that had become difficult with age. Then they made their way downstairs to the kitchen, the room that had been Clara's domain for nearly 40 years. She moved to the stove, intending to make breakfast, but Matthew stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Let me," he said. "It is your birthday, you should rest." Clara laughed. "I have been resting my whole life with you," she said. "But all right, just this once." She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many moments of joy and sorrow and everything in between. She watched Matthew move around the kitchen with the ease of long practice, making coffee and frying eggs, and she felt a swell of love so strong it made her breathless. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked, catching her watching him. "Everything," Clara said. "How far we have come. How lucky we have been." "We have been lucky," Matthew agreed, bringing her a cup of coffee. "But we also worked for it. We built this life together day by day, choice by choice." "Yes," Clara said, "we did." They drank their coffee in the quiet morning light, and Clara looked around the kitchen that had been her sanctuary, her workplace, her kingdom. She thought about that first spring, when she had still been healing from her father's death and her own trauma, when Matthew had given her space and time to find herself again. She thought about the first meal she had cooked in this kitchen, nervous about whether Matthew would like it. She thought about the thousands of meals that had followed, the bread she had baked, the preserves she had made, the children she had fed at this table. This kitchen had seen her bloom, just as the whole house, the whole ranch, the whole life she had built with Matthew had seen her bloom. From the frightened, broken woman hiding in the root cellar to the confident, loved matriarch she was now, the transformation had been nothing short of miraculous. And it had all been because of Matthew, because of his kindness and patience and love. The children and grandchildren began arriving mid-morning, filling the house with noise and laughter and the chaos that Clara loved. There was a party in the yard, with tables laden with food and children running everywhere. Clara sat in a chair of honor, holding the newest great-grandchild, a tiny girl with Matthew's green eyes. As the sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in those familiar shades of pink and gold, Matthew took Clara's hand and led her away from the party, out to their favorite spot by the creek. They sat on a bench he had built there years ago, and Clara leaned against his shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Matthew asked. "For saving my life, for loving me, for building this beautiful life with me." "Thank you for hiding in my root cellar," Matthew said with a smile. "Best thing that ever happened to me." They sat in silence, watching the water flow past, listening to the sounds of their family celebrating in the distance. The Montana landscape stretched out around them, wild and beautiful and home. "I love you," Clara said, the words as necessary and true as breathing. "I love you too," Matthew said. "Always have, always will." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara felt at peace. Her life had been full of love and purpose and joy, far beyond what she could have imagined on that cold December day when she had hidden in Matthew Turner's root cellar, desperate and afraid. She had been running from death, but she had found life instead. She had found Matthew and he had found her, and together they had built something beautiful. The years had been kind to them. They had faced challenges and overcome them together. They had raised children who were now raising children of their own. They had built a ranch that would continue for generations. But most importantly, they had loved each other deeply and truly from that first winter to this moment, and they would continue to love each other for whatever time remained. As they made their way back to the house, their grown children and grandchildren making room for them at the table, Clara looked around at the faces she loved and thought about legacy. This was what she and Matthew would leave behind, not just land and cattle and buildings, but love. A family built on love, strengthened by love, defined by love. That night, as Clara and Matthew lay in bed listening to the house settle around them, Clara said, "Do you remember what you told me that first day, when you found me in the cellar?" "I said a lot of things," Matthew said. "Which part?" "You said that my being alive meant something, that we were both still here, still alive, and that meant something." "I remember," Matthew said. "You were right," Clara said. "It meant we had a chance to build this life, to love each other, to create this family. Being alive meant everything." "It still does," Matthew said, kissing her forehead. "Every day with you is a gift." They fell asleep holding hands, the way they had for 40 years, and Clara's last thoughts before sleep took her were of gratitude. Gratitude for the day Matthew had found her in his root cellar, for his kindness and courage, for the life they had built together, for every precious moment of their love story. The years continued to pass gently. Clara and Matthew grew older still, their steps slower, their time more often spent in quiet companionship than active work. The ranch continued to thrive under John's capable management, with the younger children all contributing in their own ways. The great-grandchildren multiplied, filling the house with energy whenever they visited. On a crisp autumn morning when Clara was 75 and Matthew was 80, they sat together on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the leaves fall from the trees. Matthew's health had been declining, but his mind was still sharp, his love for Clara still the bedrock of his existence. "I have been thinking," Matthew said slowly, "about the root cellar." "Oh," Clara said, surprised. They rarely spoke of those early days anymore. "I want to go see it," Matthew said. "One more time." Clara understood. She helped him up, and together they made their slow way across the property to the hillside where the root cellar was still used for storage. Matthew opened the door and peered down into the dim space below. "I stood right here," he said. "Opened this door expecting to find potatoes and found you instead, the greatest surprise of my life." "I was so scared," Clara said, remembering. "I thought you were going to turn me in, or worse." "I knew from the first moment that you were special," Matthew said. "I could see it in your eyes, even terrified as you were. There was strength there and determination. I knew I could not let you go." "And I knew," Clara said softly, "even then, even in my fear, that there was something different about you, something kind and good. My instincts told me to trust you, and thank God I listened." They stood there for a long moment, remembering, Then Matthew closed the door and they made their way back to the house. That night, Matthew's breathing became labored, and Clara sent for the doctor and the children. They gathered around his bedside, this family he had built, and Matthew looked at each face with love. But it was Clara's hand he held, Clara's eyes he sought. "I love you," he whispered, his voice weak but certain. "Best thing I ever did was bring you up from that cellar into my life." "I love you too," Clara said through her tears. "You saved me. You gave me everything." "You saved me too," Matthew said. "You gave my life meaning, purpose, joy." He passed peacefully just after midnight, surrounded by love with Clara's hand in his. Clara felt her heart break, but she also felt grateful that they had been given so many years together, so much love, so much life. The funeral was large, attended by everyone whose lives Matthew had touched. He was laid to rest on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a headstone that read, "Matthew Turner, beloved husband, father, and friend." Clara visited the grave every day, bringing flowers from the garden, telling him about the children and grandchildren, sharing her life with him as she always had. Clara lived for 5 more years after Matthew's death, cared for lovingly by her children. She remained sharp and engaged, delighting in her great-great-grandchildren, still offering wisdom and love to anyone who needed it. But everyone could see that a part of her had gone with Matthew, that she was waiting to join him. On a spring morning, when the world was blooming with new life, Clara passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 80. Her last thoughts were of Matthew, of their love story, of the incredible journey from that root cellar to this moment. She was buried beside her husband on the hill, and her headstone read, "Clara Turner, beloved wife, mother, and friend." But the story did not end there, because the legacy of Clara and Matthew lived on. Their children and grandchildren continued to run the ranch, continued to live with the values of kindness and hard work and love that had been modeled for them. The house remained a gathering place for the family, and the kitchen, Clara's kitchen, continued to be the heart of it all. When the great-grandchildren asked about their ancestors, about the people whose photographs hung on the walls, they were told the story of how Matthew had found Clara hiding in his root cellar on a cold December day, frightened and desperate. They were told how he had shown her kindness when she needed it most, how he had fallen in love with her and she with him. They were told how by spring she had been blooming in his kitchen, transformed from fugitive to beloved wife. They were told about the life that had grown from that chance meeting, about the love that had sustained a family for generations. And in that way, the love story of Clara and Matthew lived on, a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of love, and the beauty of a life built together. The root cellar still stood, a reminder of beginnings. The kitchen still warmed the house, a reminder of home. And the ranch still stretched across the Montana landscape, a reminder of what two people could build when they faced life together. The end.